We're here with Oram Miller, who's a building biologist and who was the lead author of a new course that's for sale at buildingbiologyinstitute.org on the subject of 5G. So, Oram, this report was fabulous, and I learned a lot, especially importantly, about the role of 4G in 5G and how what's rolling out right now is going to be largely 4G, and that it is the foundation for 5G and will be what is used for, I think you said 90% of cellular transmissions for the foreseeable future. So can you just talk a little bit about what's going on with 4G right now?
Well, 4G is already deployed through 300,000 what are called macro cell sites, or what people typically think of as a cell tower. And these have a range of about a mile to a mile and a half. So 4G means the fourth generation of cellular technology. So every 10 years or so, we have a new generation of cell technology that's been introduced. So the first generation 40 years ago was just voice. Second generation added texting to that. And it wasn't until 20 years later that third generation came out, where we added cellular data, where you could actually access a website. And that eventually led to, streaming audio. Well, actually, streaming audio came in the fourth generation, which is 4G, when LTE came out, which is LTE, or long-term evolution, was added at the end of the third generation, or third decade. So 4G LTE includes the capability of streaming audio and streaming video now, and in high definition. That's all an evolution of 4G within the decade that we've just finished. And so what 5G really means, it's just an umbrella term for all the technologies and all the upgrades that are taking place now, and have been in development for decades, by the way, that are taking place in this decade. So this is now, we're in the summer of 2019 as we're recording this, and already we've had introduction and deployment of certain elements of 5G. So what people need to understand is that 5G, quote unquote, is just an umbrella term, as I said, and it will include a number of enhancements and upgrades of existing 4G LTE technology, which is not going away. It's going to remain and be built upon, as well as the introduction of specific 5G technologies that have not been in use before, that are going to be deployed particularly in the frequencies that are above 20 gigahertz. So what people need to understand is that there's really two bands of frequencies. There's the existing band of frequencies that we use now, which go from 600 or 700 megahertz up to about 3.5 to 5 gigahertz, and that's the existing frequency. And some of that spectrum has recently been auctioned off by the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, to the four major carriers in the United States: Verizon, Sprint, AT&T, and T-Mobile. And these carriers have bought up frequencies that have become available as the military has given it up, and as we've gone from analog to digital TV, certain frequencies have become available. And they've been bought up by the cell companies and used. And so 4G LTE technology that we all have now with our cell phones and our tablets, and also fixed wireless for internet service, that's all been in use, and it has harm. And people need to realize that that's not going away. That's very harmful, and it's always on.
Not going away, but they're putting the antennas up now very close to homes in the antenna densification, and that's what I want to focus on, is what's happening with the antenna densification with 4G, and then later we can talk about 5G. So what can you tell us about the plans for antenna densification with the 4Gs coming so close to homes?
So what I understand from attending an industry conference that was held here in Los Angeles last September, and I'll go back again, it's going to be in October this year, where 22,000 engineers come together for 2 or 3 days. And I learned a lot, a tremendous amount, from engineers and representatives from the antenna manufacturers and cell companies. And what I learned is that they have the 300,000 macro cell sites, and these 4G antennas are about 1.5 miles apart. But in order to to use this higher bandwidth, because you're going into frequencies that are above 20 gigahertz, when you go up into frequencies that are that high, you can download data much faster, and you have what's called lower latency. And latency is the speed at which things happen in this data connection. And with lower latency, then things happen in more in real time in terms of the perception of the user. So, for instance, virtual reality is more virtual and more real when you have lower latency. And also, the download speed of downloading a movie is quicker. But also for autonomous cars, which is one of the things that they're touting this for, cars are going to end up talking to each other, not through some central hub or central system, because that decreases latency. For cars to talk to each other, it needs to be real time so that you avoid crashes, because things happen in split seconds. So this latency is one of the big issues, and that's possible when you use the millimeter wave frequencies above 20 gigahertz. And they're called millimeter because that's the actual length of the wavelength. It's only a half an inch or a quarter of an inch, just a few millimeters. The problem is when you're up in that spectrum above 20 gigahertz, which has been used for decades with satellites and military and airport radar and such. The problem is the wavelengths are so short, they are blocked by trees, by buildings, by standard building materials, not even just needing shielding materials like, carbon-based Y-shield paint and fabrics that we have that block and solid aluminum foil, building foil that's very thick and you can put in your walls. These are the tools that we use as building biologists and in the EMF community to protect against the intrusion of the 4G signals, which are below 6 gigahertz, because that's the frequency that we've been using up till now and will continue to use. And those frequencies have a longer wavelength of anywhere from 5 inches to a foot, but they can penetrate through walls. And so we need special shielding materials to block them.
Let's go back to 4G. I want to focus on 4G and what's happening with these antennas that are going up in my town and other people's towns.
Right.
This 4G, as I understand it, is not the same 4G as we've had in the past. It's actually been enhanced with beamforming and some of these other new technologies. So I'm wondering if you could go through the changes to the 4G that are part of what's being rolled out now, like the beamforming and things like phased array antennas and MIMO and whatever is relevant to 4G.
Okay. So a little primer on all that. A lot of this is contained in the report that I wrote, the technical online course that I wrote, and it's also in this link that you sent to me recently, 5G for Dummies, Sprint Business Special Edition. And that was put out by the Sprint company, but it has a lot of useful information in it. And basically, so over the course of the last decade with 4G LTE, we had regular 4G LTE that was brought out in 2010 and had a certain speed of 150 megabits per second. And then around 2011 to 2014, in the middle of the last decade, they had what's called a 4G LTE Advanced. And then in 2017, 4G LTE Advanced Pro. And now we're launching 5G and adding to the 4G with 5G, fifth generation, in 2018, 2019, 2020, and so on. And so with each successive generation here or iteration of LTE, we've had an increase of speed from 150 megabits per second to 1 gigabit per second, and now exceeding 1 gigabit per second, and then with 5G exceeding 2 gigabits per second. And then, so we have what's called carrier aggregation. And carrier aggregation means that data will travel on multiple paths at the same time for greater throughput. And so what's involved with this new 5G technology, whether it's in the frequencies below 6 gigahertz that we're already using and can measure and need to shield against, or the new 20 gigahertz and above frequencies that don't penetrate walls as easily and need to be beamformed, which I'll explain in a moment, is automation. There's a tremendous amount of automation and self-organization of the network where it balances itself on the fly. They talk about edge computing where antennas out in the field, whether they're large macro antennas every mile and a half or the small cell antennas, which are going to be much closer together because the signals don't go as far with the super 20 gigahertz signals with 5G. So they're putting them on in neighborhoods, and I'll get to that in just a second. But all of that needs automation and computers and artificial intelligence to manage. So that's what makes all this possible. And then you talked about MIMO. So MIMO stands for multiple input, multiple output. And standard 4G LTE antennas that are on these macro cell sites that everyone sees now, these tall, skinny antennas that have about 120 degrees of range, and they're always on. They're always flooding the airspace in front of them for a mile to a mile and a half with constant RF energy, and it does decrease exponentially with distance, but it's really harmful. So you don't want to live near one of those things, and it's hard to shield it. And I encounter this every day in my work as a building biologist and electromagnetic radiation specialist. So those have 2x2 or 4x4 antennas. That means you'll see 2 antennas and then 2 more below them. That's 2x2. That's 4 altogether, or 8 altogether if it's 4x4, or 16, excuse me. And they're a little bit bigger because the wavelength is longer because they're less than 6 gigahertz. I know this is all very complex, but that's what we have now. Now, we've had enhancement of this with more data throughput, and so that's getting faster without getting into 5G, but the massive MIMO is going to be 8 by 8 because they're using antennas that are much smaller, and they're going to be in a square box, and they're already being deployed now. You can see these up on towers and buildings. And also inside your phone, you need little miniature versions of these to receive that signal and send it back. So the massive MIMO will allow multiple users to be connected at once, and all 64 antennas are used to aggregate the beam into a focused narrow beam. It's called beam casting or beam forming. And that's the only way that signals that are above 20 gigahertz in the millimeter wave spectrum can get through a building wall, just standard building materials.
They're also using the beam forming in 4G.
Technically speaking, beam casting or beam forming is part of 5G, and remember, 5G is being introduced in all of these frequencies. And by the way, just so your listeners understand, there really aren't any cell signals right now between 6 gigahertz and 20 gigahertz, although there are a few things that are coming in there. But
I thought there was police.
There are many other frequencies, but not for civilian use. In other words,
right.
Military, radar, every little square foot, so to speak, of the radio spectrum is used by somebody.
And my question for you is, shouldn't we also be concerned with what's happening between 6 and 20 gigahertz to measure what's going on in their neighborhood if they live next to a police station? Or
Well, yeah, I was going to say, what it all boils down to in terms of health, the potential health impact of all of this on people's physiology is how close are you to the transmitter? How close are you to a transmitter? And there are 2 transmitters. There are the transmitters that are outside your house that are either, radio transmitters, which have their frequency in the AM and FM band. Then there's, if you're near an airport, radar from an airport goes out 25 miles. And you have police, military, then these satellite dishes, which are more point-to-point. So it all depends on how close you are to these things. But bear in mind that radio frequencies always drop off exponentially with distance. So the closer you are, if you're really close, then it's really strong, and then it drops off, and the 90% drops off within a few feet, or depending on how strong the transmitter is to begin with. You wouldn't want to live near a radio tower. I have a client who is just downhill from a radio transmitter here in Los Angeles, and she had to move because her son was symptomatic. They had over 100,000 microwatts per meter squared pouring into the house, into the boy's room, through the wall and window, no matter what shielding we did. And the other thing that people need to understand, and this is very, very important, and it's overlooked, and people don't get it. They don't know the danger that they have from the other transmitters that are part of the package, and that is whenever you're dealing with these devices, from routers, from when you're connecting to a cell tower outside your house for voice or text or data, websites and email and Instagram and Snapchat and all that sort of stuff. What people don't remember or don't realize is it's a two-way street, that the device in their hands and in their pocket and on their bedside table and on their desk is transmitting back to the cell tower that's outside, whether it's 4G or 5G. and that's strong too. The problem is all of this is invisible and silent and odorless. It's not like cigarette smoke that you could see and smell. So people don't know that it's there. What helps you become aware of it is either you get symptomatic,